40 years ago, the miners' strike was in full flow, a bitter dispute between working-class miners and a Margaret Thatcher determined to change the UK. Thatcher definitely changed Britain, but did it halt decades of decline, or did it sow the seeds of today's problems? To understand Thatcher, we first need to look at the 1970s. It was a decade of rampant inflation, industrial strikes and economic stagnation. The pound was declining fast and the UK economy was falling behind its main competitors. There was a general sense that something needed to change, and Thatcher was ready, with radical free market policies, monetarism, privatisation, shrinking the state. The post-war consensus was over. Thatcher's first task was to reduce inflation. Interest rates were increased and government spending cut. The economy went into recession, but inflation continued to rise. Thatcher just doubled down, putting up more taxes and raising interest rates further. A disciple of monetarism, she was determined to squeeze the money supply until inflation fell. The result was predictably a deeper recession and a surge in unemployment. Unemployment rose to its highest level since the Great Depression, over 3 million or 12%. But in the inner cities and the industrial north, it was even worse. Youth unemployment soared, contributing to the wave of riots which spread across British cities. Manufacturing output fell 20%. 364 economists wrote a letter to the Times claiming there was no basis in economic theory for Thatcher's approach. But Thatcher did not believe in U-turns.
U-turn if you want to. The ladies not for turning.
Thatcher wanted to shake up industry, end state subsidies, and let failing firms go under. But in the early 1980s recession, it was so deep that even efficient firms were going under. And despite the recovery later in the 1980s, UK manufacturing was never the same. Britain would become a very different economy, dominated by the service and financial sector. With unemployment still hovering around 3 million, Thatcher's next target was reducing the power of trade unions. She had not forgotten the feeling that in the 1970s, it seemed the unions could hold the country to ransom. Industrial action and strikes were a major problem for British industry, with productivity hit by persistent disputes, poor management, and a lack of investment. UK productivity growth was one of the lowest in the world. One thing is for certain, through both legislation and economic recession, union influence was massively reduced. In the late 1970s, union membership and power reached its peak. They never really recovered. Time lost to strikes fell quite dramatically, but the modern labour market has become much more fragmented, with zero-hour contracts and working-class areas never regaining the same kind of pride and community spirit. One effect of Thatcher's economic policies was a 25% rise in income inequality, something that's never really been reversed. There was also a growing north-south divide, with former industrial towns struggling to reinvent themselves. And the idea of towns being left behind in the north was a factor behind some of the resentment towards the establishment and the Brexit vote of 2016. The fact that inequality rose under Thatcher's economic policies is not a surprise. Her free market ideology sought to reward enterprise and reduce the role of a welfare state. Throughout the 1980s, taxes were cut for the high earners and business especially. Corporation tax fell from 52 to 35%. The highest rate of income tax was cut from 83 to 40%, though VAT, a more aggressive tax, was nearly doubled. At the other end of the spectrum, low-income workers saw a rise in unemployment and a fall in the relative value of benefits. Even healthcare spending was squeezed during the 1980s. Her most controversial tax was replacing local rates with a poll tax, using a simple logic that millionaires should pay the same tax as a nurse. It was free market overreach that eventually cost her her job. Another flagship policy was privatisation. Throughout the 80s and 90s, the government raised £70 billion from privatisation. Harold Macmillan likened it to selling off the family silver. And we could make a sharp contrast between, say, Norway and the UK. Both benefited from a North Sea oil bonanza. But Norway retained part ownership and set high taxes and invested the proceeds in a sovereign wealth fund, which now stands at $1.4 trillion, the biggest in the world. But the UK didn't take the same opportunity to invest. In fact, during the 1980s, public sector investment as a share of GDP fell quite sharply. The proceeds from oil were used to fund tax cuts rather than investing in Britain's creaking infrastructure. And it's this short-termism that has become a feature of the British economy today. Another significant form of privatisation was the right to buy your council house, a scheme that benefited over 1.5 million households who benefited from being able to buy their own property. Home ownership rates soared in the 1980s, and the policy may have been fine if the proceeds were used to build new council housing to replace the lost stock, but the ideology of the 1980s was to leave it to the market. Social housing supply fell dramatically, and low-income households were left to move into the more expensive private rented sector. And this is a real legacy of the 1980s we see today, as housing supply fell behind rising demand, causing housing to reach record levels of unaffordability, house price to income ratios not seen since the Victorian age. The home ownership dream has turned into a nightmare for young people who are having to spend at least 19 years to save a deposit to get a house, and house price to incomes reaching the highest level for years. After inflation was tamed through a deep recession in the early 80s, the economy started to boom, especially in the southeast. House prices soared and the City of London saw an influx of investment and wealth, benefiting from financial deregulation. The Chancellor talked of an economic miracle. The laggard UK economy was turned around by privatisation and the government's supply-side reforms. The pain of the early 80s was starting to pay off. It was a good story, but unfortunately the reality was a bit different. As the economy boomed, inflation crept up, private debt rose, and the balance of payments went into deficit. The UK was living beyond its means. The economy was getting too hot, and despite falling oil prices, inflation started to creep up. There had been no economic miracle. Growth rates in the 1980s were very similar to the growth rates of the 1970s. But by believing their own hyperbole, the economy fell into an inflationary boom, which popped in 1991. The result was a housing crash with negative equity, a deep recession, and unemployment once again rising to 3 million. After all the pain of ending inflation in the early 80s, the return to inflation was entirely self-inflicted, with the UK left with the highest rate of inflation in the developed world. The failure of the UK Chancellor to manage the economy led to the decision in 1997 to give the Bank of England independence in setting monetary policy. One of the great successes of the UK economy in the 1980s was the growth of the financial sector. The Big Bang regulation allowed the city to throw off regulations and give them the freedom to dream up new financial instruments, credit default swaps and the like. The financial sector has become increasingly important to the UK economy, a major source of income tax revenue. But the growth of the city also exacerbated regional inequality. The UK economy increasingly reliant on London. Outside London, the UK is increasingly a poor country, with some of the poorest regions in Europe. And although the growth of megacities is a feature of modern economies, it is more pronounced in the UK than anywhere else. Also, there was another quite worrying long-term consequence. Financial deregulation in both the UK and US led to an increased risk-taking by the private sector. Former building societies like Northern Rock and Bradford and Bingley took on high-risk, highly leveraged lending to maximise their profits. But in 2008, the global credit crunch hit their business models, and they would have gone bankrupt without government intervention. It highlighted the limits of the free market. Left to their own devices, the financial sector is prone to excessive risk-taking and moral hazard, knowing that if they win, they gain big bonuses, but if they lose, the government acts as lender of last resort. What were the successes of Thatcher economics, if any? Well, with regard to Europe, Thatcher gained a significant rebate from the EU on the basis that the UK lost out because of a common agricultural policy. Thatcher also helped to negotiate Britain's entry into the single market. The reduction of tariffs and barriers to trade provided significant benefits to both business and consumers. One study by the Department of Business estimated income gains of 2 to 6% of GDP per year. Also, Thatcher's reluctance to join the ERM and the scepticism of a single market was borne out by the events of Black Wednesday and the UK's forced exit from the ERM. After the pain of the early 1980s, towards the end of the decade, the UK did start to become successful in attracting a new generation of foreign investment, such as the Japanese car factories in the northeast. What about the mixed successes of Thatcher's economic policies? Now, although Thatcher increased inequality, there was a strong argument that tax rates were too high in 1979. With a marginal rate of 83%, it does cause disincentives and can be counterproductive. The punitive tax rates did as much harm as good. Also, a corporation tax of 52% would have been very internationally uncompetitive, as many other countries were cutting their corporation tax in this period. The inflation of the 1970s did need reducing, and it was eventually brought under control. However, economists say that rigid adherence to monetarist targets caused more economic pain and more unemployment than was necessary. In the end, the monetarist experiment was abandoned because the link between the money supply and inflation was so weak. Also, there was definitely a case that industrial relations needed improving, both through reforming unions and improving management of business. The number of days lost to strikes in the 1970s was unsustainable. However, there was definite bitterness about, say, the miners' strike and the lack of empathy with the regions devastated by pit closures and industrial decline. Sticking to free market policies, there was an unwillingness to do more to support and protect those who were made unemployed by the big changes in industry. Even if it was inevitable that coal mines would one day close down, more could have been done to ease the transition into a post-industrial economy. I live in Cowley, Oxford, which is very close to the Cowley car factory, which now makes the new Mini. But in the 70s, it made British Leyland, the Morris Minor and Morris Marina. Their reputation for cars was not very good in the 70s, partly because industrial relations were so bad. And I've got at least 2 elderly neighbours who used to work there in the 1970s. And my next door neighbour, but 2, he really hated the unions because he said that they were perennially on strike, enjoying the political action, whereas all he wanted to do was to be able to go to work and feed his family. So he always tells me he was a big fan of Thatcher because he wanted the unions reformed. And it was interesting for me to understand why Thatcher had quite a degree of support amongst the working classes. But that's only a very limited anecdotal evidence, but it's still interesting to my perspective. I would also put privatisation in the bracket of mixed success. If you look at academic studies, they give mixed results, with many suggesting public or private ownership actually makes less difference than you might imagine. Some industries probably did benefit from private ownership, primarily those who had no public good, like, say, BT or British Airways. Other industries, like, say, water, have been much less successful, with private owners putting profit above investment. They increase debt to pay dividends rather than investment. Now, rather than going from one extreme to another, there was a third way to combine the benefits of private enterprise and public ownership. For example, in the early 80s, the UK privatised oil 100% and gained much less in the long term than, say, Norway, which retained around 70% state ownership in the industry. And I made a video contrasting the fortunes of these countries with North Sea oil. It shows how the UK experience could have been different if it had a more mixed approach rather than an ideological free market privatisation approach. Hope you enjoyed this video. Please do subscribe. Thanks a lot.